Okay, is my stream up? Am I here? Am I live? Can y'all hear me? Let me see what's going on. Talk to me. Alright, hold up. Had to sit up, lock in, and adjust the pop filter. One time. Should I move my logo here? No, we'll put it here, but we'll make it smaller. That's what we'll do. Okay. Oh, I don't know why I had Druid shit up. This is not what I wanted to talk about. Well, not by itself anyway. We'll close this out. So, Wowhead about 2.5 hours ago put out a Mythic Plus tier list video guide, I should say, not video, but article updated for 11.0, right? And this is nothing new. Wowhead does this every season. They do one for raids, they do one for Mythic Plus. This expansion is no different. And I'm going to go through each of them because I think there's some major talking points that I want to just kind of get out there, right? So we have the DPS, we have the healers, we have the tanks. And according to Wowhead, each list was created and maintained by a prominent member of the WoW community. The DPS list was created and maintained by Tettles. The healer list was created and maintained by Automatic Jack, and the tank list was created and maintained by Yoda. All of these guys, if you play WoW, you know these guys, right? They're decorated players. They know what they're talking about, so on and so forth. There's really not too much bad things to say about either of these gentlemen, right? I follow all of their YouTube channels. I partake in watching some of their streams, so I feel like I'm pretty familiar with their content profiles as well, right? That being said, that does not mean that I don't have the right to disagree with some of the things that they're saying, right? So I'm going to go through the overview, and then I'm going to go through the ones that I kind of really have, I won't say problem, but for lack of a better term, problem with. Starting with the DPS one. So the DPS one, again, was created and maintained by Tettles, and I should probably full screen this real quick. Boop. Yeah. Make sure y'all can actually see this. Okay, yeah, it looks like y'all can see that. All right. I don't know, my logo's floating around looking crazy. Let me slow it out. There we go. Okay, so the DPS list, to be quite honest, probably is the one that I had like the least. I won't say the least, but the least issues with. I think there's arguments for both. Off at face value, I think that the S tier, not having a DPS S tier, I guess is kind of fair. The A tier, I kind of agree with. I think Affliction Warlock could have been bumped up into that A tier category. I think if you even click on the Affliction Warlock profile to explain why it is where it's at, he even mentions that Affliction could have been A tier. So Affliction was one that I probably would have bumped up a little bit. And for the most part, the category that these guys are, the factors that they're using to tier these things is, for the most part, the same. Damage profile, utility, survivability, right? That's pretty much the same across the board for each role. It's probably weighted a little bit differently when you go from role to role, but it's all still there. Those components are there, right? And I think if you just look at the A tier, it's really kind of a no contest. Like the A tier is just, in my opinion, by and large, just better than the other tiers, for one reason or another. Like if we look at, we all know why Evoker's there, so I'm going to skip Evoker. But Frost DK is doing ungodly amounts of damage, and it also has the benefit of being a DK. It's damn near unkillable because it has so much defensives. Icebound Fortitude, Anti-Magic Shell, which now is put on 2 other people, even though it's at a lesser value, it still helps shave off a lot of magic damage that's incoming. It has Veteran of the Third War still, which just is a 20% stamina increase, which is kind of phenomenal for a melee DPS. It still has a battle res. It still has Death's Advance to make immunity to knockbacks. It still has A-bomb limit. It still has Death Grip. It still has all these things on top of just doing absurd damage. So Death Knight being here, I'm actually kind of happy to see. Kind of warms my cold heart because y'all know Death Knight is my favorite class. I got a soft spot for it. I'm cool with that. Arcane Mage, I mean, you can't really be mad at, what most people would call Blizzard's poster child class, quote unquote, the Mage. It's funny to see Arcane Mage in A tier and Fire in D for once, but, I digress. That all that means is Fire's probably going to get a buff at some point. But anyway, I think Arcane Mage is kind of warranted here as well, because Arcane does ungodly amounts of single target damage, but the caveat to that is its AoE rotation is just its single target rotation. So when you have like super high or the highest single target damage and that same damage just spills over to AoE, I mean, you already know what that's a recipe for. So I can see Arcane being there. Assassination, I think, has really, really high uncapped AoE especially when you consider the other melee, right? So Assassination was going to be there. Plus, it's a rogue; it's still going to bring things like Shroud for skips and Sap, and it's going to be not as unkillable as like a Death Knight, but still has solid defensives. And the Shaman specs is also fun to see. I never really had like a super kind of soft spot for Shamans, but I know historically they have not been there, and for one reason or another, whether it was their survivability, whether it was their damage output, whether it was a combination of the both, whether it was utility, like there's always been kind of a reason not to have a shaman in the super high tiers. But now that's all changed, right? Shamans bring important dispels, curse and poison, really powerful, really, really important. I won't say powerful, but really important in this season, especially with Poison Cleansing Totem being solid. They have pretty solid defensives now too. They got a lot of talent changes. I know Elemental, I don't know if this is the case for Enhanced, but I know Elemental at least has the talent where when you interrupt something, you take like 15% reduced damage from the school that you interrupt and a stack. So it's kind of crazy. On top of still having Astral Shift and Ghost Wolf DR and stuff like that. So the defense is actually not that bad anymore. And I think they get, at least Elemental gets like either like a 3 or a 5% DR just for having your elementals out. So yeah, shamans aren't as squishy as what you may remember them being. But again, by and large, as a whole for the DPS tier list, I don't have too much to say. I think they got it right pretty much. I think if Tettles did write this, I'm not saying he did or he didn't. They are saying he did, so I can only take what they say, half-heartedly in my case. I think the DPS tier list is kind of okay. I'm not a master at every single DPS spec, but just off of what I've studied from watching people stream the beta and watching videos and watching and having my own beta experiences, I can say that I think Affliction is probably the one that I probably would have bumped up a little bit. Maybe even Ret, and that might just be hindsight because Ret just got those changes, so that could also be just hindsight. But yeah, I think DPS is the okay one. Moving on to healers. So I think the S tier, and this is written by Automatic Jack, I think the S tier is pretty solid. I don't think the other healer specs really they really can't compete with Resto and Preservation, Resto Shaman and Preservation Evoker. Both of those specs bring very important dispels. We talked about, the dispels, the Poison Cleansing Totem from Ellie and Enhance. That obviously is the same for Restoration, right? On top of the fact that they still bring utility that you really can't find anywhere else, like extra health from Ancestral Vigor, like the shortest ranged interrupt cooldown. Like I think their wind shear still might be 12 seconds. So they still just bring things that the other casters and healers just can't compete with. Outside of the things that maybe some of them can, like you really can't compete with Poison Cleansing Totem because you put the totem down, it dispels, and you can still continue to heal. It doesn't take a GCD. It's not on a cool. It is on a cooldown, but it's not like a cooldown like your real dispel. And they still have the ability to actual dispel. They still can dispel curses. They can still just by and large pump so much healing. And I think the sleeper for Resto, and I don't think he listed this in the description, but the sleeper for Resto Shaman is that it's pretty easy to pick up and play. It's not too much complexity when you're talking about it. So when you have something that has like a low barrier entry or a low skill floor, it's a little bit less punishing on the learning curve, meaning you won't really find too many detriments to it. Now that's kind of the opposite for preservation. I think preservation is actually one of the harder healers to kind of pick up and play because it doesn't heal naturally. It doesn't heal the same way as the other healers, right? It has a shorter range. I think that's probably always the biggest gripe I hear about Evoker is that it has I think a 30-yard range instead of the 40 plus that other healers get. So it has a shorter range, so your positioning matters greatly on a preservation. It has the what I call it combo healing, where you're not just traditionally healing. Like preservation doesn't have the like a healing wave type ability. They do, but it's very inefficient. Like they don't have a heal button that you just press casually just because. Their healing comes in waves of combo. So you set up your echoes, you set up your reversions, you set up your stasis, you set up your life binds and your dream breaths, and like all these things are comboed. It's not just I press a button, big healing goes out. You kind of got to link it together. So that being said, preservation still has really, really high, to me, in my opinion, the highest burst healing, like because of stasis and rewind and Emerald Communion and all these things that the other healers just can't really do concurrently, right? Like all of the healers have some sort of healing burst potential, right? You look at Monk. Monk has like a cooldown for every single problem, but once those cooldowns are out, that's it. You know what I mean? Whereas a preservation can do the burst healing over and over and over, pack to pack to pack. Right? They're not really waiting on cooldowns. Some of the setups do wait on cooldowns. Like sometimes you do have to wait for stasis to come up. You do have to wait for rewind to come up. You do have to wait for your dream breath to come up. But dream breath is like what, a 20-second cooldown. So it's like it's not really waiting. You know what I'm saying? Effectively, you would have dream breath almost every pack. So on top of the fact that again, Prez also brings really powerful dispels. It has Expunge, which we all know is the everything dispel, including Bleeds, which is really important. It still has a poison dispel, which is really important, right? It still has great utility in, a ranged interrupt, the knock up and the knockback. It still has Quelling Roar to lengthen the time of CC, right? So it has certain things that other healers just can't do. The A tier, I think, is pretty okay. I would have made a case for Mistweaver being in the A plus tier, but being that I've spent some personal time with Mistweaver on the beta, my personal experiences kind of falter with that. And this could have just been because I'm relatively new at Mistweaver Monk, right? So maybe my play actions weren't the best. But one thing that I did find was that Mistweaver, well, number one, there's a lot of ground canceling and zoning effects in these dungeons. And that kind of hampers on Mistweaver's ability to maximize Jadefire's stomp and standing in your Jadefire to get your buffs. And again, that could have just been me. That could have just been me in poor positioning and not really getting, and kind of getting my feet wet with the melee healer, right? But I like to consider myself a pretty okay player, and I can kind of read situations, and I only need something to happen to me one time for me to understand how to counter it. And I was just going through these dungeons and I was like, oh man, like it just feels bad being cut off from, if I run one way and the tank runs the other way, like I have to now catch up and kind of still hit the mob to get my healing off and stuff like that. So that kind of felt a little wacky. But overall, I think Mistweaver in A tier is pretty okay. Like I said, I would have made a case for A plus, but he didn't do any like in between tiers. So respect, A is okay. Holy Paladin, I don't really know too much about Holy Paladin. If he says it's A tier, I'm going to go right along with him, to be quite honest with you. I don't really have too much experience with Holy Paladin. I know they got a pretty solid rework going from Dragonflight to War Within, but I don't have too much insight on Holy Paladin, so I'm going to just chill there. The B tier. So the B tier is interesting because at first glance, I wouldn't have put Resto Druid and Holy Priest in the same tier as Disc. Disc is kind of hurting right now. I'm going to be honest with you. Disc is kind of hurting right now. I think it's marred on the fact that it has a pretty high skill floor, right? It's not something that you could just pick up and play. That's number one. Number two, the tank nerfs and the changes into Mythic Plus as a whole and stuff like that, I think kind of hurt Disc because Disc is a very proactive healer, but it's a proactive healer that doesn't always match its throughput, right? Like, as an example, Resto Druid can be a proactive healer. You set up your hots, you make sure your harmony is running, you're pretty much golden, right? You don't have to do too much after that. But Disc is a little bit different because you have to kind of read what's going to happen before it happens. And if you get caught off guard, the recovery is kind of horrible. If you get caught off guard on a Resto Druid, I mean, you can hit Tree Form and just apply more hots. If you get caught off guard on a Disc Priest, a little bit more damaging. On top of the fact that their hero talents aren't really great. So it's kind of tough. Disc is in a weird spot, but Holy and Resto, especially Resto has been historically, Resto Druid anyway. Resto Druid has been historically a great Mythic Plus healer. It's always done solid damage when the healer damage mattered. It's always had a good healing profile. It's always had a good utility. You know, Poison Dispel, which I said is important this tier or this season. Curse Dispel, which is important this season. Has a battle res, has Ursol's Vortex, has Mark of the Wild. So it on paper it has all of the things that a great Mythic Plus healer should have. I think the problem is that the hero talents didn't really do anything for it. There weren't really any major changes in Resto Druid, and if anything, there were kind of some nerfs, right? Like I know for a fact, the Photosynthesis and Flourish combo talent. Now that's a choice. No, you don't just get both. That to me, like I played Resto Druid in Dragonflight season 3 and a little bit in 4, and I wouldn't have liked that back then. And I know they also weakened the power on the Grove Guardians, the little tree boys that you summon to help heal you. So I don't know if there's really a case that can be made to put Resto higher. You know, just having historically good heals isn't enough in this case. Like I have the healer reasoning over here, and let's just quickly go over what he has said. Restoration Druid is in an incredibly odd position in the Season 1 of the War Within. They have perfect Dispel profile. We talked about that. They have a low cooldown on their kick, strong damage, crowd control, and ray buff. The issue is predominantly how their healing has become considerably more tedious and GCD intensive. So a healer locked behind GCDs, yeah, I can understand that. Photosynthesis and Flourish, yes. Now share choice, no, yeah, I knew that was a problem. Like I wouldn't have liked that. Growth Guardians are massively weakened, yeah, we knew that. And Regrowth feels like a major ability that produces healing, but only if you have multiple hot stack with Life Bloom on the target. That's unfortunate. So it looks like it just got run down with the changes. That's unfortunate. I like Resto Druid. Resto Druid used to be my favorite healer. So that's kind of unfortunate. Holy Priest is always a healer that I want to win. And every season I don't see it winning, and it makes me sad. But I mean, Holy Priest it just has the same problems over and over and over, season to season to season. It's either the utility isn't really useful, or you can get better elsewhere, right? Because if Shadow Priest is good and Shadow Priest brings forth, then who cares? If Shadow Priest has not Mind Bender, if Shadow Priest has Mass Dispel just like the other priest, then who cares, right? And it's a shame because the one thing that the priest was always good at is just raw healing. Holy Priest is just really good at raw healing. The problem, especially with this tier, is that the Holy Priest just doesn't have the utility to back it up, right? It doesn't have a thing like a leg sweep. It doesn't have a Ring of Peace. It doesn't have, pardon me, an AoE stun. It has Psychic Scream, but that's it. It doesn't even have an interrupt. Like, it doesn't have a Wind Shear. It doesn't have a rebuke. It doesn't have a Spear Hand Strike. Like, it doesn't even have an interrupt to actually contribute something. So that's really going to hurt, on top of the fact that it can't dispel poisons and it can't dispel curses. Two of the prominent dispels of this season. So it's no surprise to me that Holy is in B tier. I think what saved Holy is the fact that it just pumps a large amount of healing and is relatively easy to play. Low complexity is probably what kept it out of C tier, to be quite honest, in my opinion. So it's unfortunate. I wanted to see Holy Priest win. If anything, if someone mained Holy Priest and they were good at it, I would let them heal me. I would consider them as a member of a group if I was building a comp, to be quite honest with you. I always liked Holy Priest. I always want to see it win. It's just unfortunate that it's marred down by the same things season to season. All right, now let's get to the tanks. This is one that I was kind of passionate about, and we're gonna talk about it. Let me get to the real shit. Hold on. All right. So here's the tank list. So there are no S tier tanks. I think that's fine. I think the tank balance honestly is actually pretty close. I think each one of these specs are pretty close to each other, where key differences may have came in the form of talent change and stuff like that. But anyway, I think that the specs are close enough that I don't think one is so overwhelmingly large against the other. Looking at the A tier, I think Druid deserves A tier. Druid is another class that's very easy, very low, very easy to pick up and play, very low skill floor. You can pick up a Druid, you can make mistakes on a Druid, you can mismanage your rage and all that stuff, and you still probably be okay, to be quite honest with you. It also has, it doesn't have short cooldowns because Oh no, it does have short cooldowns. I'm not even gonna say that. It has short-ish rotational cooldowns, right? Because Barkskin's like what, a 30-second cooldown. Rage of the Sleeper, even though it got nerfed, is still a 1 minute CD. Ursock is a 3 minute cooldown, but it's reduced by Rage when you spend it. So I'm not mad at Druid. Druid still brings all of the utility that the other Druids bring: B-Res, Ursol's Vortex, Poison and Curse Dispel, Soothe, Mark of the Wild, right? It has all of the natural Druid utility, plus it's just easy to pick up and play. Plus it's pretty sturdy on the front end of tanking mobs, right? It's not weak. It doesn't have to really generate too much, even though you kind of want to go into each pack with an Iron Fur up. It doesn't. It's not like a Blood DK where like you're facing life and death on a pull. It's nowhere near like that, right? And it has pretty solid self-sustain, right? Frenzy Regen is pretty solid. So I think Druid being an A tier is okay. Vengeance Demon Hunter. So we all saw the culling of the Vengeance DHs when they nerfed Illuminated Sigils, when they did the tank nerfs. I don't think Vengeance was hit that hard from that, but the end of Dragonflight nerfs is really the bigger changes for Vengeance. I don't know if I would have put it in A tier. I think here tanks is where I would have also did some like sub like tiers, right? So like maybe Vengeance goes in either a B plus or an A minus. But I don't know if I can put it side by side with Druid because it's not a hard tank to play, but it's not as easy as a Druid to pick up and play. I don't think it's just a pick up and play friendly tank. There's still some things you have to know. It lost, quote unquote, for all intents and purposes, it kind of lost the ability to really use Last Resort, which is its cheat death, because the way the talents work now, you can't really take Last Resort without sacrificing some big power. And that's unfortunate too. So it kind of lost the ability to really use its cheat death. You can still take it by any means. If you're doing a high key, take it, but just know that you are going to see a notable decrease in your damage. That's just the reality of the situation. It lost its ability to have double sigil, so there's no more 2 charges on Sigil of Silence or Sigil of Chains or Sigil of Fire. But it still has the 1 charge of each of those abilities, and even Sigil of Fire is on a CDR thanks to the change they did to Illuminated Sigils. I think it's still pretty sketchy outside of demon form, right? I think most, if not 100% of Vengeance Demon Hunters play demonic, which means we have a higher uptime on meta. And in meta, you're basically a god. But outside of meta, I think you can, especially in the hierarchy, you're probably still going to feel some pain on certain trash packs. But Vengeance is tanky enough, does a lot of damage, especially if you're Felscar. Felscar does a lot of damage. It has solid self-sustain. It does bring solid utility, offensive utility for the most part. Chaos Brand is what I consider offensive utility because it's a debuff. It's not like, a buff on things. It has an AoE stun. It has a lot going for it. I just don't know if it's as strong as the Guardian Druid. If we scroll down and we can see some of the things they talk about, it's pretty much the stuff that I just talked about. One thing I would like to note is that it's saying it's the defensive loss for Vengeance is kind of shored up by the Thrill of the Fight and the Incorruptible Spirit talents. And I'm pretty sure these talents are Eldrachi stuff. And you don't really play Eldrachi Reaver. Like right now, it's looking like Felscar is going to be the mainstay because of just how much raw damage it's doing. Whereas Eldrachi is more than likely going to be tested and tried in higher keys because it does have a better defensive profile. I'll give it that, but at the cost of just doing massive amounts of damage. But it still gets by. So I can't even say that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would have put Vengeance in the A tier next to Druid. Then we get to the B tier. So I'm gonna straight up say this: I do not like the reasoning Yoda put for putting Prot Warrior of all things in the B tier. So Prot Warrior, if you don't know or you didn't see anything on beta, is basically just straight up immune to physical damage, blockable physical damage, we'll say. Because Shield Wall and Ignore Pain just shave off so much damage, it's almost unfair. I think the caveat to all of this is that Prot Warrior is kind of like the inverse of Blood, where Blood takes a lot of upfront damage but heals it all back, so it doesn't really matter. Prot takes very little upfront damage, but has no self-sustain outside of like impending victory and like temporary health increases from last stand and rallying cry. But none of that matters when you just don't take damage. So if we're looking at this, if we scroll back up and we see this tier list, hold on, let's highlight it. Oh shit. Not the whole thing. So this tier list considers 3 primary factors as tank survivability, damage, and what they provide in Mythic Plus dungeons, right? Tank survivability, damage, and what they provide in Mythic Plus dungeons. You know what 2 boxes that the warrior checks automatically? Tank survivability and damage. We already spoke about how well warrior takes damage. They also do a lot of damage, especially in AoE thanks to the Mountain Thane. You could play Colossus. You'll definitely see a lot of high single target damage, but you trade a lot of rage generation when you play Colossus, and it's just not worth it. It's just not worth it, in my opinion. They might change it, who knows. But Mountain Thane does a lot of damage. It generates a lot of rage, and in turn, that fuels both your offense and your defense. Now, what they provide in Mythic Plus is the reason that he listed Prot Warrior in B, but let's read it real quick. Protection Warrior is very tanky and does relatively high damage among tanks, especially with Spell Reflection. I'm going to stop right there and say there's a lot of things that you can Spell Reflect in as a Prot Warrior in these dungeons. A lot of things. Even things that you didn't think you could. Even blockable abilities that you might not think you can Spell Reflect. Going back to this. However, with Mage and Augmentation in the meta, it can be hard to get value out of Battle Shout, so replacing it in B tier. Like I said, I think this is a cop-out, weak as fuck excuse to put protection in B tier. Granted, this statement isn't wrong. I can understand what he's saying. He's saying with Mage and Augmentation being in the meta, those are casters, obviously, you don't really get value out of Battle Shout. But you know what's also in the meta? Assassination and Enhance. So I'm a little confused as to why Battle Shout, having that one discrepancy and ignoring the other 2 prominent factors of Warrior, automatically puts it in B tier. Because if I had to roll the dice, I would say a Warrior is more tanky than both of these 2 classes. It's a little bit closer for Guardian Druid because Iron Fist's kind of broken. And Barkskin is up every, like I said, like 30 seconds or something like that. So it's a little bit closer with Druid. But the problem with, like, I'll say this, like, I think Warrior takes physical damage the best over Druid because after, like, 4 stacks, Ironfur, you don't get as much value. You're always going to get value from blocking, right? Like, you either are going to block or going to critical block, right? That's just how it works. And Druids don't do as much damage as Warrior. So they kind of lost that damage fight there. What helps Druid is that they bring Mark of the Wild, and Mark of the Wild is better than Battle Shout by and large, I think, in my opinion. But, yeah, to say because Mage and Augmentation are in the A tier or in the meta, that devalues Warrior, to me, is not it just doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound right at all. Because if I'm a Prot Warrior and I'm running with the other 2 melee that are A tier, or if I'm running Aug Assassination, or if I'm running Aug Enhance, or if I'm running Assassination and Enhance, that kind of fixes the problem right there. So I'm a little confused. On top of the fact that it's not like Warrior doesn't have other utility. It still has Rallying Cry. It still has Intervene with that new Storm Shield talent that puts a magic debuff on, not a debuff, a magic shield on the targets that intervenes. It still has Spell Reflect. It still has Shockwave. It still has Stormbolt. It still has a lot of things going for it. So it's not like the buck stops at Battle Shout. It still has these other things that it can do. So I'm a little confused as to why Battle Shout was the end all be all in dropping Prot Warrior. And to be quite honest, I'm not the biggest Prot Warrior fan. I played it in Dragonflight Season 1. It was cool. I never had anything against Prot Warrior, but I also know the value of their strength. So I don't know. I feel like this is a cop-out. I'm going to keep it a buck. This is a cop-out. I don't know why he worded it like that. I don't know if he worded it like that. He might have not did this. This might have been Wowhead. Who knows? But Yoda, if you did write this and you see this, I don't know. You're kind of a big streamer, so you probably ain't gonna see this. But if you do see this, just know that Soul said you wildin', my guy. You wildin' for putting Prot in B tier because of Battle Shout. Yeah, it's like that. Moving on to Blood DK. Blood DK, to me, has lesser of a case for being in the A tier, but I'm gonna make my argument anyway because I'm biased and I like Blood DK. Fight me. So Blood, seen especially in the beta cycle, has seen a lot of changes. Like at first, Sand Lane was the best hero talent, and then we saw Sand Lane get horribly nerfed, and now the Reaper's Mark is the best one. And on top of that stuff, Blood still got a couple of new talents. Even in like Dragonflight Season 4, we saw the talent revamp. It got a couple of new things. Certain things got changed. It's now a lot easier to take both Bloodshot and Umbilicus Eternus. And it's really, I think he even states it here, it's really the only tank that can take Purgatory with no downside, right? Like Purgatory is just the best cheat death. I know Paladins have Ardent Defender and they have that other thing that auto procs there, Guardian of the Ancient Kings. We ain't talking about that right now. Purgatory will stop you from dying no matter what you take. Case closed. On top of the fact that Blood now, especially comparative to all the other tanks, really is the best de facto self-sustained tank. When played correctly, the healer really doesn't need to heal you. The healer can focus on other things. This is, doubled down by the fact that Blood, just like the other DK specs, just brings so much cooldowns. Vamp Blood, AMS, IBF, AMZ. It still has Purgatory, Lichborn. Like the list continues on. Dancing Rune Weapon. Like it has so many cooldowns and so much, and it still brings things like Death Grip and Battle Res and Death's Advance for certain other things. Like it can definitely control packs on a level that's equal, maybe sometimes better than like Sigil of Silence Vengeance or Divine Toll spamming, Avenger Shield spamming Paladin. So it's similar. And now Gorfiend's Grasp even has a talent attached that silences everything when you use it. So Death Knights definitely have mob control locked down. Again, I'm going to highlight the part here. He put Blood DK in B tier because it doesn't have a raid buff and it has kind of average damage contribution. So the damage thing I can kind of understand, because if you're comparing it to like Prot Warrior or Fellscarred Vengeance, pardon me, if you're comparing it to those, yeah, Blood might be faltering a little bit because it just doesn't do, especially for Fellscarred, it just doesn't do that much damage. But Demon Surge is also kind of broken. That's the Fellscarred ability. It's uncapped magic AoE that you can literally proc. What's the cooldown on Fell Devastation? Like 25 seconds effectively when you have that one of the talents. Like yeah, you're gonna pump as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. I think I have one of my streams where I did a heroic and I was absolutely blasting. So I can understand the damage part. The raid buff thing, again, I think the theme here for the tank part is, I think we're just leaning into these raid buffs and debuffs a little bit too heavily. I think we can just kind of get Mystic Touch all the way the fuck out of here. Like Mystic Touch is the weakest of the buffs / debuffs, right? It's 5% physical increase, but ask yourself how many DPS specs actually do just pure physical damage, right? Think about it. Just think about it. I think we have Outlaw, right? We have Feral. We have Warrior. The both Warrior specs, Arms and Fury. So we just say Warrior. And we have Windwalker. I think Windwalker does a fair amount of physical. So that's 4 specs. 4 out of, how many we got again? All of these. 4 out of, we'll count them. What is this? 5, 10, 14, 18, 22, 25, 26. 4 out of 26 specs. It's not really great ratio there. So Mystic Touch, we can just kind of get all the way out of here. Oh, where's the tank one? There we go. Somebody about to watch this back and say, so you counted wrong. I might have. I don't even care. But yeah, we can just get Mystic Touch out of here. Skyfear, I think, is a really good buff. 2% mastery, and even though mastery isn't the greatest for all specs, like I know for Vengeance, mastery is kind of the lowest on the stat priority. Mastery is still mastery. It's still a damage increase, right? And in certain cases, and for tanks, if you look at tanks, it's still a damage and a defensive increase. And plus, Skyfury still does the Wind Fury effect. So it's great for casters, tanks, melee DPS, everybody. Everybody loves Skyfury. Mark of the Wild is great. 3% versatility. Again, even though versatility may not be the best stat for everybody, 3% increased damage and 1.5% reduced damage taken, you can't be mad at. Arcane Intellect, now that it's 3% instead of 5%, I think it's kind of lost its luster. Same thing with Chaos Brand, but even I think Chaos Brand gets a pass because so many specs melee included do magic damage that who cares if it's 3% now? So many specs do it. Whereas Arcane Intellect, only a handful of specs cared about intellect. So there you have it. But Blood not having a raid debuff, I think, is kind of shored up by the fact that it has almost second to none mob control, second to none survivability for tanks, and it still provides certain things that other tanks can't do. I can understand Blood being in B tier way more so than the Prot Warrior. I think Prot Warrior should have been in A tier for sure, but I don't like it. I don't like it being in B tier. I think Prot Warrior. I think Blood DK I think it does competitive enough damage even relative to the other tanks, on top of its survivability and its own personal cooldowns and stuff like that, on top of the fact that it still has decent mob control. Mob control is important. Mob control is important, especially when you're trying to nuke down certain high priority mobs, or you're just trying to clear packs. If you're running with a comp that has a lot of uncapped AoE, or you're running with a comp that does a lot of priority damage, I think mob control goes hand in hand with that. So Blood should have been like a B+. I would put Blood in a B+. And then we have the C tier. So I think it's no secret at this point. Prot Paladin is kind of just like what did he say? Paying for the sins of the no healer keys. You know, the thing where in the MDI and Season 1 Dragonflight where people were just bringing 4 DPS in a Prot Paladin. Yeah, Blizzard didn't like that shit. And rightfully so. Like, you don't want a tank spec just straight up eliminating another role. Like, that's kind of crazy. So I can understand that. So Prot Paladin has kind of just been on the back foot. To me, it's still a sleeper pick for some of these key pushes because we're in an interrupt meta, right? Like Blizzard changed the fact that AoE stops no longer actually stop an interrupt cast. As an example, if I use Incap, if I'm a Guardian Druid and something is casting and I use Incap Roar, it'll stop the cast as the mob is disoriented, but as soon as that debuff is broken or wears off, it's going to go right back to casting. Whereas if it's interrupted, it's locked out. And Paladins obviously can do a lot of interrupts thanks to Avenger Shield and Divine Toll and Rebuke and stuff like that. So I think it's still my sleeper pick, but the changes, like Paladins got hit hard with the tank nerfs, and I think they're kind of getting hit even harder with some of the other changes that's coming up for Paladins because they're losing some pretty important talents and they're getting replaced with not so good talents. So Paladins are kind of struggling right now. So it's no surprise to me that they're in C tier. No surprise at all. Especially with like things like Sentinel being like just a goofy, non-factoring cooldown now. Sentinel used to be the shit. Like Sentinel was crazy, and now it's just kind of silly. Word of Glory doesn't do any healing. Like, yeah, Paladin, you down bad right now, Paladin. So I hope y'all get y'all time again because y'all down bad right now. Monk was a surprising C tier pick for me because Monk, at least in my opinion, throughout the course of its beta lifecycle, has been performing pretty well, both on damage and on the defensive value. I think Monk still has the smoothest damage intake, especially when you're doing something like when you're progressing or you're first stepping into a higher key because of stagger, right? You're always just going to take less upfront damage and you're going to be able to, shave it off by purifying your stagger. Monk still has pretty solid utility. It still has leg sweep, Ring of Peace. It still has a poison dispel, a poison and disease, but diseases aren't that prominent right now. But it still has its own poison dispel, right? It still has, if you need to use it, I don't really think there's much need for it anymore. But if you need it, it still has Ox Statue for some AoE taunt shenanigans. Like it had a lot going for it. It removed a lot of its button bloat, which was a big problem for Monk. Like I had too many buttons. I'm kind of glad that they got rid of some of that stuff. So Monk being in C tier, like next to Paladin, is kind of weird because I feel like, one, it's way more tankier than Paladin, right? Its damage profile is a little bit better. It does provide weaker utility, like not weak. I can't even say weaker. No, we'll say weaker. It does provide weaker utility as a whole, but Ring of Peace and Leg Sweep are still goated, so who cares? I think the only caveat to that is that Monk is it's kind of like Warrior, right? Where it's just very, very limited in its self-sustain factor. And so is Paladin too, because Word of Glory ain't shit. So I'm surprised that he put Monk in the same tier as Paladin because Monk is to me a better tank than Paladin, to be quite honest with you. There's a joke. There's a joke on the DPS Mythic Plus tier rankings where Frost DK is more tankier than Prot Paladin thanks to Veteran of the Third War. And if that is the case for a DPS spec, then you can't tell me that Monk deserves to be in the same tier as that tank when it has stagger. There's no way. Ain't no way. Ain't no way you could tell me that. So I feel like the Monk tiering is a little bit harsh. A little bit harsh. So, but yeah, that's my spiel for this tier stuff. I think DPS ones are alright. I was surprised to see Resto Druid in the same tier as Disc Priest because of how Disc Priest is going right now. I think Prot Warrior got an extreme disservice. I think it should definitely be an A tier. I think there's argument for Blood to be in like a B plus, A minus type tier, and Brewmaster shouldn't be in the same tier as Prot Paladin. That's kind of crazy. I'll close out by saying this. Tier lists are always fun to make and fun to watch, right? There's a tier list for everything. There's a tier list for breakfast cereal. There's a tier list for colors, right? Like there's a tier list for everything. And it's even more fun when they're coming from people of, reputable sources. Like these three guys, Tettles, Yoda, and Automatic Jack are all three prominent, WoW people. I think when you have such polarizing tier lists, in my opinion, as the tank one, it kind of can drive the community in a bad direction, right? And regardless to who writes it, whatever you put up there, I think tier lists just do that in general, right? Like, I'm sure if you go in your own respective discords, like your own class discords, whatever class you play, somebody somewhere has posted these tier lists and said, LOL, you're this tier, LOL, I'm this tier. It happens. But when you have explanations like Prot Warrior is B tier because of Battle Shout or because Mage and Aug are in the A tier for the meta, I feel like that kind of sends the wrong message. Because I'm going to keep it a buck with you. If you're a new person who didn't play I was going to say Battle for Azeroth. If you didn't play Dragonflight, hell, if you didn't play Shadowland, if you're just coming back to WoW for War Within, you're not going to read any of this disclaimer shit. You're not going to read any preambles. You're not going to read what we read in the stream today. You're going to go straight to this picture. And you're going to see these tiers for the tanks. Or you're going to go to the healer one. Or you're going to go to the DPS one. And you're going to look. And you might go to the little description like I did. And if you do, you're going to see things like this. Because of Battle Shout supersedes the strength of a Prot Warrior. Kinda nutty to me. So that's it. That's all. I don't think Wowhead or Yoda or Tuttles or anybody's going to change any of this stuff. I'll say this. The only way they change it is if after the 17th, when Mythic Plus happens, if we see more tuning for the classes, which I don't know if we will or we won't. They kind of seem to be handing out reworks like candy. We just saw Paladins get another talent rework, so who knows? But yeah, that's all I got to say on the matter. If y'all stuck with me during it, I appreciate it. If you catch this on the watch back, I appreciate it. Y'all know what time it is. Y'all been great. I've been Soul and I'm out. Peace.